Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Spring 2021 lecture series. My name is Frank Sliegers. I'm Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at LERP. And before kicking this off here, welcome. I want to make some announcements. First, I want to express my gratitude to the individuals who supported the organization of the series behind the curtain. First, Nathan Chung, MIP student, who's also serving the first TA of the Zube lecture series, and is incremental for technical and organizational assistance. Then Stacey Richardson, our finance assistant and special projects coordinator at the LP office for organizational management, and Chris Ramage for creating a beautiful overall and individual poster for the speakers. And of course, Earth, Zube, and his wife Margaret. Earth Zubers have been the former head of LARP from 1974 to 1980, and they made an endowment in 2004 to bring scholars to the department to stimulate and enrich our academic community in landscape architecture and planning. And so far, the Zube endowment has been supported by alumni, students, and faculty. And also today, we start our new course, Zube Lecture Series in Landscape Architecture, Region Planning, and Sustainability. And in the spirit of Earth Zube, this course is an introduction to critical topics in design and planning as a medium for envisioning social, cultural, and ecological life of regions, cities, and landscapes. So sorts of works of local, national, and international academic and professional leaders. And we have diverse themes. They articulate climate change, resiliency, social equity, urban design, arts, landscape aesthetics, and cultural heritage. And I thank you also the students from all the disciplines of this new class and backgrounds. And before I hand it over, I want to just announce the next lecture. So it's on Tuesday, February 16th. So not on Thursday. I'm gonna just share my screen here for a second. This will give this beautiful, it's designed by Chris Ramage. So next week, no lecture, but Tuesday and Thursday and the following week, we have 2 lectures. And so this information is all on our website, and I'm happy that we can kick off this Zube lecture, and we'll hand it over to Camille Barchett, Assistant Professor of Regional Planning, to introduce our today's speaker.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you everyone for coming to our first Zube Talk of 2021. I'm very excited that Eric Gordon accepted our invitation to share his time with us today. Professor Gordon is currently a visiting professor in comparative media studies and writing at MIT and a professor of media art at Emerson College, where he also directs the Engagement Lab. His research focuses on the transformation of public life and governance in digital culture and the incorporation of play and care into collaborative design processes. He is the author of 2 books about media and cities, both of which I heartily recommend, The Urban Spectator and Net Locality. He is also the editor of Civic Media, Technology, Design, and Practice, and his most recent edited volume, Play as Humanistic Inquiry, was just released last month. His most recent monograph, Meaningful Inefficiencies, Civic Design in an Age of Digital Expediency, examines practices in government, journalism, and NGOs that reimagine urban innovation beyond efficiency. His work has been very influential for me and has clear contributions to our work in this department in both city and regional planning and also landscape architecture. I won't spend too much time previewing Eric's talk, but he's going to be discussing the formation of a living laboratory in Boston that seeks to co-design collaborative governance mechanisms with a wide range of stakeholders. I think that this work, along with Meaningful Inefficiencies, it tells us what it means to center care in urban governance, an increasingly timely and important consideration for those of us working in planning, architecture, and policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Eric. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Camille, for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure. So I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me for a second. Okay. All right, everybody can see that? Yep. Okay, great. All right, so I'm thrilled to be here today and talk to you about some new work I'm doing in collaborative governance. I'm speaking to you today as a scholar, a designer, a practitioner. I'm also speaking to you as a resident of Boston, which is an important part of the story I'm going to tell this afternoon. So I'm thrilled that you're all here today, especially many of my collaborators in the collaborative governance work in Boston are here in the Zoom room, and I'm really, really honored to have you here, and just pleased to share this work. So the pandemic has exposed inequities and injustices that have long been in place, but have been relatively easy for power brokers to ignore. As a result, cities around the country are pursuing major reforms of policing, education, and health systems to better align with a growing public awareness of their inequities. This is taking place through sweeping policy declarations, bold value statements, and attempts at changing institutional cultures through anti-racist trainings, workshops, and in some cases, bold new leadership. This is well captured in the example of Cori Bush, who was recently elected in the US House of Representatives in Missouri. So I'm going to share with you just a brief excerpt of her acceptance speech, and hopefully this will play for you.
Or so St. Louis. If you know nothing else, you remember this. My Congresswoman-elect, soon to be your Congresswoman, loves you. Your Congresswoman-elect loves you. And I need you to get that, because if I love you, I care that you eat. If I love you, I care that you have shelter and adequate, safe housing. If I love you, I care that you have clean water and clean air and you have a livable wage. If I love you, I care that the police don't murder you. If I love you, I care that you make it home safely. If I love you, I care that you are able to have a dignity and have a quality of life the same as the next person, the same as those that don't look like you, that didn't grow up the same way you did, those that don't have the same socioeconomic status as you. I care. And we will.
All right, I'm going to stop that there. Let me go back. I think you can see my presentation again. So these powerful words from Congresswoman Bush are a stunning example of what I call careful leadership. She boldly articulates her love for her constituents and declares simply that she cares. And while this is a moving declaration, it is at this point political rhetoric. The problems we are facing right now in American cities are systemic. Paths forward will require leadership, as demonstrated by Congresswoman Bush, but that is not all. The trough of mistrust and illegitimacy of public institutions is not just a matter of a bad policy or two, it's a matter of long histories of oppression and systems of governance that have and continue to exclude those people who are most impacted by decisions. So Sherry Arnstein, in her seminal work from the 1960s, introduced the concept of a ladder of participation, where consultation was on a low rung that she described as tokenism. 50 years later, despite changing rhetoric, this is still how we govern. Decision makers consult with the public in overly exclusive public hearings, and then they often retreat to a black box where they make decisions. As a result, there exists deep mistrust in government and most other formal institutions. The pandemic has only heightened those divisions, drawing attention to the structural inequities that limit a government's ability to act. When governments and all the other public serving institutions were forced to respond last March to the pandemic, most sought to engage in good faith efforts to care for all of their residents. But despite that good faith, those efforts often failed to reach those who needed the care most. So, for example, last March, the city of Boston organized a lit drop in the neighborhoods to quickly inform people of emerging public health practices. They created a flyer in 8 languages and attempted to quickly distribute it around the city. But there were challenges, as pointed out by Mari Rojas, a community activist in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, also someone who's here in this room today, in an email that she sent to Boston's Chief of Civic Engagement on March 23rd, 2020. She writes this. She says, "I am appreciative of the ONS staff and understand that the lip drop was a very important initiative. This valuable information could have been much more efficiently distributed through the neighborhood civic groups. The civic groups know the neighborhoods in real time, not just by a map, are trusted by neighbors, work with each other to share information, and work with each other to take care of our community. Civic groups are the boots on the ground daily, not just for emergencies, but all the time." And she goes on to describe what that looks like and what some of the challenges were in the distribution of that literature. So my talk today is not about government, but it's about governance and what kinds of structures can actually realize Mari's position that problems should be solved by those who trust each other to share information and to take care of communities. New, sometimes younger politicians with bold ideas and renewed leadership are important, but unless structures of governance change around them, they will be incapable of careful governance. Systems wherein those directly impacted by decisions are not just consulted on answering the question, but are invited into defining the questions and setting the agenda. So I recently published a book with Gabriel Mugar called Meaningful Inefficiencies, in which we argue that public sector organizations, instead of merely seeking the most efficient way to deliver goods and services, need to deliberately and conscientiously design inefficiencies into systems so that people can build trust and procedures through trusting each other. This includes transparency in the use of data, non-extractive relational modes of consultation, and an explicit commitment to investing more in those that need more. So we argue that public institutions transform through the deliberate creation of relational spaces. And we see in moments of crisis that if that relational infrastructure doesn't exist, governing defaults to top-down procedures and fails to care for constituents. So building this infrastructure is not easy or cheap, and typical government reform is focused on enhanced efficiency and more reliable transactions. But I'm going to argue that while this was never enough, the efficiency ethic is particularly limited at this moment. Any reform that seeks to repair government organizations without considering the mechanics of the government interfacing with the governed is merely amplifying the crisis of institutional mistrust we find ourselves in today. So what I call careful governance is a way of thinking about the mechanics of prioritization and decision-making on a city scale that decenters government influence while incorporating all sectors in the distribution of caring responsibilities. So here's what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I'll introduce governance reform movements from civic tech to collaborative governance and discuss their unique importance at this moment. I will explain how collaborative governance is manifested in urban living laboratories, or ULLs. There are structures of experimentation and innovation in cities. I'll then introduce the concept of care ethics and point to the importance of centering care in governance. And then finally, I'll discuss a new effort in Boston called the Boston Collaborative Governance Initiative that is attempting to make this a reality. So let me get going with talking about something called new public management that many of you may be familiar with. It emerged in the 1990s as an alternative to traditional forms of top-down decision-making in public administration. To counteract the perceived unilateral decision-making processes of municipal government, NPM focused on the consumer of government and the effectiveness of agencies to deliver what the consumer wants. NPM includes such characteristics as quasi-markets, agentification of bureaucracies, contracting out services to private consultants, and consumer choice. The neoliberal logic of new public management provided a justification and enthusiasm to the growing civic technology movement in the United States. Specifically, early government tech was focused on streamlining services and cultivating a customer service model through the individual use of apps. In 2000, the city of Baltimore was the first US city to embrace civic technology. And its CityStat program was an attempt to organize all of its services within a single digital platform to cultivate a quality assurance culture in government and to collect and organize citizen-generated reports and share across agencies. The logic guiding this work was an efficiency ethic, crowdsourcing customer needs and perception into the functioning of a public agency. The goal of CityStat, and quite frankly, nearly 2 decades of civic tech to follow, was to enhance government efficiency through interagency data sharing and more participation. Not a terrible goal, but one that does not transform the values of government institutions. It ossifies them by speeding up what they do. So 311 is a system for collecting problem reports and directing them to the appropriate agency to resolve. It's the most cited civic tech example in both scholarship and practice because it has generally been quite successful at doing what it does. Boston was the first city in the country to develop a standalone 311 app, and it remains an exemplary case study in what is sometimes called public sector co-production. But 311, while opening up avenues for input, is a one-way street. People can report the existence of known problems, potholes, trash, snow removal, etc., but it doesn't enable input into defining problems. The user can't tell you what matters to them or their community if it's not already built into the system. Short of transforming government hierarchies, 311 trains people to be good users of the existing system. And this is not a technology problem. The tech does precisely what it was designed to do. Technology will reflect the existing systems in which it is built unless there is explicit attention to designing for something different. So this is where the discourse of collaborative governance comes in. NPM, New Public Management, which I have suggested is the underlying philosophy of early civic tech, was critiqued by scholars as a neoliberal response to traditional public management. It sought to transform public agencies through market logics, and it reimagined citizens as customers. In parallel, but not in direct response to civic tech, scholars and practitioners became interested in actually challenging neoliberal assumptions of how government functions, indicative of an enhanced awareness of urban inequalities and a marked decline in the public's trust in public institutions. So in short, the conversation moved from how to make government better to how to think about the logics undergirding government, or governance. So according to Jerry Stoker, governance refers to the rules and forms that guide collective decision-making. That the focus is on decision-making in the collective implies that governance is not about one individual making a decision, but rather about groups of individuals or organizations or systems of organizations making decisions. Making a decision in the same way decisions have always been made, only with more input, is not a change in governance. It is merely a change in scale of input. So collaborative governance models, on the contrary, focus on building mechanisms of government decision-making that are inclusive of multiple sectors and concerned with building deliberative forums. So there are 6 characteristics of collaborative governance as defined by an oft-cited article by Ansel and Gash from 2008. And they define it this way. They say that the forum is initiated by public agencies. Participants in the forum include non-state actors. Participants engage directly in decision-making and are not merely consulted by public agencies. And the forum is formally organized and meets collectively. The forum aims to make decisions by consensus, and the focus of collaboration is on public policy or public management. So I'll return to these characteristics in detail later in my talk. For now, it's worth noting that these characteristics were derived by examining hundreds of experiments in collaborative governance around the world. And mostly they manifest in discrete projects focused on specific domains and specific policy areas like school committees or business associations. They tend to be micro mechanisms that interface with specific agencies within government. So perhaps the most obvious example is participatory budgeting, which builds a collaborative mechanism around a small portion of a city's budget, but rarely has impact on the whole of the budget process. So participatory budgeting is an example of an experiment in governance. It takes different forms, but it is typically a well-designed multi-stakeholder process that in its cordoned off playing field provides real agency to the players to imagine new futures and make binding decisions. It operates in a mode of experimentation where new ideas can be tried out, the consequences of failure are limited, and there is opportunity to learn from it. So in this way, according to Josh Lerner, it functions like a game. Or more to the point, it functions like a laboratory. Propose, experiment, fail, learn, propose again. So PB is a good example of what is often called an urban living laboratory, or a multi-sectoral mechanism to imagine and invent new tools or policies. The concept of an urban living laboratory was first introduced by William Mitchell at the MIT Media Lab in 1997. And he defined a ULL as an innovative approach to testing new technologies and strategies to cope with complex social problems. Ostensibly, the laboratory metaphor sparked the imagination of people working in and around the public sector who were looking for dynamic ways to frame collaborative innovation. So there are three peculiarities typically used to identify a ULL. The process has an organizational approach inspired by the quadruple helix, so collaboration between the public sector, firms, universities, and communities. It's an experimental methodology that I've been describing, and open innovation, where knowledge can be diffused across stakeholders. Most ULLs, as I've said, are project focused and tend to create structured learning environments around specific policies or technologies. So for example, my team created a ULL in Boston in 2018 called Beta Blocks to enable community-led experimentation with urban technologies. We identified zones in the city where permitting could be relaxed and urban technologies could be tested within a community-led process, resulting in structured recommendations to city government. And while there are certainly some examples, other examples in the US, they have been extremely popular in the European policy sphere, with dozens of examples in Sweden, Austria, and the Netherlands alone. Notably in Malmo, Sweden, the Malmo Innovation Platform brought together industry, academia, and government to focus on the novel housing solutions. Vision Step 1 in Villach, Austria is focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy in the outskirts of the center city. So generally, ULLs are a specific manifestation of a collaborative governance structure that tend to focus on tech innovation and project-based exploration. But as demonstrated in decades of academic literature on the topic, they tend to be short-lived, domain-specific, and rarely influential on the underlying logics of governance in a city. So as the pandemic has made abundantly clear, reimagining governance is not simply an exercise in better decision-making. It is an essential infrastructural shift to establish a foundation of trust for public institutions to function at all. So think back to Mari's letter to Boston's chief of civic engagement. She didn't want to just be consulted. She wanted the civic organizations that actually care about the impacted communities to have been a part of the planning. Mechanisms of collaboration that lack what Joan Tronto calls caring with, or the distribution of caring responsibilities, will fall short of enabling public institutions to rise above a context of deep mistrust. So, I mean, just consider Sidewalk Labs' experiment in Toronto, which shut down last year with seemingly no love lost by the communities with which it interacted. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about Sidewalk Labs, but just as a sort of fringe ULL, it's something to consider. So to review, I started with the observation that there is bold new leadership expressing new sentiments of care. I then made the case that leadership is important, but not sufficient, and that new mechanisms of governance are required to match the rhetoric. Civic tech, which is often in the face of public innovation, has historically been guided by the logics of new public management that too heavily relies on privatization and individual consumption. I then introduced collaborative governance as a critique of NPM, new public management, and a different paradigm through which to imagine governance innovation. And I explored the ULL as a specific manifestation of that paradigm. So now I want to complicate matters a bit more. And I want to say that collaboration is value neutral. It is possible to collaborate on outcomes that harm people. However, it is not possible to build trust in public institutions without a belief that one is being cared for by those institutions. So I now want to discuss the value of centering care ethics in the design of new governance structures. So what does it mean for public governance to be guided by a care ethic? In fact, what does it mean for institutions to care at all? The family or the private sphere was up until the modern era the center of all care provision. Health, education, personal fulfillment. Care was domestic labor and largely isolated to the home. This began to change in the late 19th century as industrialization and changing labor necessitated that public institutions claim some responsibility for the public's care. As Hannah Arendt argues, the transfer of care from private to public happens in parallel to women's liberation beyond the private sphere, her right to work, her right to vote. Moving caring responsibilities out of the home contributed to the imagination of public institutions as sharing in these formally private responsibilities. But the distribution of responsibilities does not mean effective action on them. Public serving institutions, from local government to journalism to healthcare, have institutionalized care as a product and liability, but have largely ignored the experiential and procedural qualities of care provision. Outside of the metaphor of the family, it is difficult to imagine what is meant by caring institutions. We tend to think about caring relationships as one-on-one, but political scientist Joan Tronto argues that while we can turn to family life to intuit some key elements of good care, to provide good care in an institutional context requires that we make explicit certain elements of care that go unspoken and that we take for granted in the family setting. So these include formal practices for evaluating and reviewing how well the institution meets its caring obligations, acknowledgement of plurality and diverse caring needs. Every human needs care. Some are just more equipped with self-care or caregiving networks than others. And being explicit about how power is used within an organization, unlike the family where power is mostly implicit and present in every interaction. So each of these three elements, evaluation, plurality, and power, are hugely important for imagining what careful governance might look like. But let me take a step back and provide some background on the concept of care. So care has two related meanings: anxious care, so I am burdened by cares, or I don't have a care in the world, and solicitous care, or taking actions for another. Most public institutions are riddled with anxious cares, liabilities, scrutinies, political efficacy, power, even as they take action to care for constituents. But as the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard claims, without care or concern, action would not be possible. We have to see the two forms of care as related. Anxieties generate actions and vice versa. In fact, actions without anxieties might lack the personal concern necessary to effectively care for another. Martin Heidegger builds on this concept of care, making it central to his primary philosophical contribution of Dasein, literally being there, or the experience of being in the world. Heidegger adds a key nuance to the definition of care. The German word for solicitous care is Sorge. He describes two forms of this care, besorgen and fürsorge, jumping in and jumping ahead. Intending to show solicitous care, one can jump in and take over for the other, who then is dominated and dependent in the caring relationship. Doing what the other can do for himself or herself, the solicitous person is actually taking care away from the other. The healthcare system in the United States is largely organized around jumping in, as the patient is too often powerless in the care relationship. Similarly, government welfare programs are often organized around a solicitous care that strips the care receiver of his or her agency. In contrast, Heidegger argues that there is solicitous care that jumps ahead of the other, anticipating his or her potentiality, not in order to take away his or her care, but to give it back. This kind of solicitude is authentic care, for it helps the other to know himself or herself in care and to become free for care. So this is the basis of what is often called a feminist care ethic, developed by Nell Noddings and later Joan Tronto, among others. They identify a hierarchy of caring relationships: caring about, recognizing a need for care; caring for, taking responsibility to meet that need; caregiving, the actual physical work of providing care; and finally, care receiving, the evaluation of how well the care provided had met the caring need. Note that care receiving is on the highest rung and perhaps the most difficult to realize. There is power in evaluating how well care has met the caring need. In this paradigm, care is not charity. It is mutual responsibility that is empowering to both caregiver and receiver. Joan Tronto, in her book Caring Democracy, adds another rung to the caring hierarchy that directly speaks to our challenge of applying a care ethic to public institutions. She defines caring with as the distribution of caring responsibilities. What would it look like if institutions were primarily driven not by anxious care, nor by jumping in to solicitous care, but by building trusting relationships with caregivers and receivers to assure that the responsibility for everyone being cared for is appropriately distributed? For example, universal housing policies that direct people to shelters without acknowledging a plurality of needs. Most don't take pets or have zero tolerance for drug use, for example. Or the policy meets the obligation as established by policymakers, but does not necessarily meet the needs of those who stand to benefit the most from that policy. Or consider the solicitous care of vaccine distribution. Recently, a vaccine site was set up at the Reggie Lewis Center in Roxbury, a majority Black community in Boston. But it quickly became clear that the vast majority of people getting vaccinated at the site were white people from other communities as far away as Rhode Island. This was not the intention. The idea was to provide more access to the hardest hit communities, but in practice, there was little attention to information provision. How do people access information, and how or why do people trust it? And as a result, those already inclined to trust the institution found a way to engage first. Just under 3% of fully vaccinated people in the state of Massachusetts are Black. So in response to this misfire, the city has set aside 15% of its appointments for people who register for a vaccine through community organizations such as the Black Boston COVID-19 Coalition and the Greater Boston Latino Network. One might argue that this is a matter of justice, but there is a fine line between care and justice. Merriam-Webster defines justice as a response to widely shared intuitions of injustice. Justice includes the movements to correct for historical wrongs, and indeed, that is the outcome of the city's corrective to the vaccination site. On the other hand, a care ethic is a highly situated response to individual needs, keeping in mind circumstances, embodiment, and relationships. Care includes the context and localized stories of those who are engaged in public matters. So while acting with a sense of justice by locating the site in Roxbury, they didn't incorporate a care ethic, which would have surfaced the challenges in effectively communicating trusted information. Williams argues that urban politics require both a care and justice ethic, that they are seen as related but independent practices. So this means imagining logics of governance that recognize historical inequalities, patterns of urban poverty, unequal distribution of health outcomes, and also individual circumstances and immediate needs. So while a justice ethic defines the rules of the game, care defines the experience of playing it. So my research is focused on emerging collaborative governance structures in cities, ones that explicitly manifest the care ethic in shaping procedures and protocols. As I have said previously, I am not interested in this as a set of novel practices. I am interested in this as a mainstream response to failing democratic institutions, ones that lack the basic trust required for minimal functioning. In this spirit, I am part of an action research initiative in Boston called the Collaborative Governance Initiative, where we are seeking to apply the normative principles of a care ethic to the formation of a collaborative governance structure. Most of the core team driving this initiative, as I mentioned earlier, are here today, which I'm thrilled about. And so perhaps during Q&A, maybe they'd be comfortable chiming in. So I'm going to turn now to the design of this initiative in my remaining time as a case study. So in November 28, my colleague Rachel Gardner organized the Boston Civic Leaders Summit with City Councilor Andrea Campbell. And back when people gathered in physical space, hundreds of community leaders came together to discuss their work and the challenges they faced in the city. I met Rachel when she asked me to sit on a panel at the event, and the event generated a huge amount of energy and desire for connectivity in local Boston communities. So of course, COVID happened and everything was different. So last March, Rachel and I started talking about actions we could take immediately to continue the conversation, share new pain points, and identify gaps in care provision. Together with Councilor Campbell, we organized a series of Zoom meetings called Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which gathered over 200 people to share and coordinate their efforts to meet the needs of people throughout the city. What we heard from people running point for care provision in the city, from mutual aid groups to informal community groups, was that they lacked the ability to coordinate with each other. They also lacked the ability to coordinate with city government. They lacked access to citywide data. They lacked the resources to cultivate trust in that data. And they lacked the procedures, in most cases, to share data between organizations. Things were happening quickly in the city, and for the community leaders who were closest to those needing care, they often felt in the dark, or at least in the spotlight, as their activities were siloed and seemingly disconnected from others. So this summer rolled around, and we were looking for mechanisms to continue the work we started in these Neighbors Helping Neighbors meetings. And I was signed up to teach a class at MIT called the Civic Media CoDesign Studio, which is a project-based course about co-design methods. And I decided to organize that course as an extension of this work. So working with Rachel, we invited 11 active participants in the Neighbors Helping Neighbors convenings to join the course as community mentors. So these mentors included staff of city councilors, directors of government agencies, and community activists and organizational leaders. And instead of asking them to visit the class and frame the problems, which is how I normally teach courses like this, we asked them to join the class and actually co-create with students. So the class met Tuesdays and Thursdays on Zoom, And the community mentors showed up every Thursday and sometimes Tuesdays also for the entire semester, which we were speaking earlier before the talk about, some of the affordances of Zoom. This course would not have been possible if people had to drive to Cambridge to come to class. So it enabled people to come together in ways that were before not possible. So projects that emerged from the class included a platform for low-income renters to report on and advocate for improved conditions for climate-resilient housing. Another project focused on building peer support for new immigrants in the city to more effectively seek government services, and another focused on improving the experience of first-time voters. 2 additional projects have already generated some traction beyond the course. Getting Connected is a paper-based guide using Zoom. This emerged out of a need for helping age-strong Bostonians access government forums. Great that all meetings were held on Zoom, but there needed to be effort put into building the digital literacy of people to access these essential services. So this project is being used by several organizations in the city already, and Democratizing Public Space is a project focused on co-designing uses of abandoned lots throughout the city. Both of these projects are continuing post the class. So last November, we received a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to extend the work of the course and build out a network to advance the project-based exploration of careful governance structures. And so I'm going to describe a little bit about this inchoate network right now. The network consists of a core team of about 10, many of whom participated in the course, who will guide the network. A large network of about 50 people so far met last month to discuss the effort and will continue to meet monthly. Project teams from the network to design, test, and iterate projects similar to the course, but that also includes research that is happening, some data visualization that's happening, things that are emerging again from the needs of the network, and public learning circles, which is a public reading group, essentially focused on care and collaborative governance. One of the things we learned from the people who were part of the course last semester is that one of the values of participating in the course was actually having a space to learn with others, and so for practitioners to have just a deliberative space to discuss was incredibly valuable. And so we are going to continue that as part of this network moving forward in a less structured environment than a class, of course. And so we're seeking to build a membership model also where corporate, academic, and public sector agencies will financially contribute to the sustainability of the network. Government and academia will always be at the table, but they will not set the table. Community will always have an ownership stake in projects. Structures of data sharing will be established that benefit those who need it most, and misinformation will be directly addressed through cultivation of trusted data brokers. So, like a living laboratory, the network is project focused, but unlike the standard ULL, we are focused on what Hubrecht et al. Call institutioning, or the micro transformation of institutional cultures. We need to assure that the work happening within the network does not simply result in a series of projects to point to, but a demonstrable shift in institutional cultures and the procedures to support it. So to do this, we will assess the work using the metrics of careful governance. So the last thing I want to share with you, this is a bit of a full slide, but the last thing I want to share with you is the move from collaborative governance as a paradigm to careful governance and some of the important shifts that are motivating this move. So in collaborative governance, the forum is initiated by public agencies, but in careful governance, the forum is initiated by the community. Collaborative governance, participants in the forum include non-state actors, but in careful governance, non-state actors set the agenda. In collaborative governance, participants engage directly in decision-making and are not merely consulted by public agencies. And in careful governance, each participant acknowledges their personal and sectoral interest and relative power as a means of building trust. In collaborative governance, the forum is formally organized and meets collectively. In careful governance, that also happens. The forum is formally organized, meets collectively, and incorporates time for personal relationships to form. And this is harkens back to meaningful inefficiencies. In collaborative governance, the forum aims to make decisions by consensus, but in careful governance, the forum aims to make decisions by consensus with an understanding that consensus is rarely possible. It acknowledges plurality in individual circumstance. And in collaborative governance, the focus of collaboration is on public policy or public management. And in careful governance, The focus of collaboration is on the distribution of caring responsibilities. So I want to leave you with this. Careful governance is not simply aspirational. When Cori Bush says she cares for people, that's aspirational. For institutions to embody values, there need to be mechanisms, not just sentiments. We need to transform how decisions get made, how data is produced and shared, and how trust gets built in the institutions that mediate public life. We need to move this field beyond a series of case studies to a deep understanding of how careful practice becomes institutionalized. We need to think about this work not as a bunch of novel experiments, but as a fundamental infrastructure required for resilience. If the pandemic is just a dress rehearsal for climate change, then if we don't make these changes now, it is abundantly clear that we're not ready for opening night. So I want to leave you with 4 calls to action for this space of careful governance. The first is to evaluate mechanisms, not just sentiments. The second is to move beyond case studies toward a study of institutional transformation. The third is to be explicit about power relations within and across organizations and design for them. And the fourth is to amplify connections between care and trust. And with that, I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to a conversation this afternoon. I hear your applause resonating through the Zoom room. Thank you so much. I don't know how you want to facilitate questions. If you do it in a certain way, happy to do whatever you like.
Yes. So typically, since we have a really large group, usually we do a popcorn style if it's a small group, but we got 75 people. So maybe we'll keep people muted, and then if you want to raise a question, you can raise your hand, like virtual hand, or send a message, and I will unmute you. So let me go open the chat, and I'll just observe. And so please either raise your virtual hand or let us know if you type in a question into the chat, and I'll unmute you. And of course, all the co-hosting professors can unmute when they want. And well, I guess let me see. We're not getting any hands. I would be happy to start with the question if the professors are not, if the professor don't want to start with the question, or if somebody from the student group can ask a question, that'd be great. But if everybody's shy, I'm happy to start with the question.
I can ask myself a question, but it'll be a softball question.
Right.
So, yeah.
Great. Well, I'll start with the question. I guess one dilemma with the and thank you, Professor. I'm Nathan, the assistant for the lecture series and the TA. I guess, one dilemma I see when I hear about these very equitable, community empowered processes is that in some ways, if you are on the state side, there's that potential loss of your relevance, so to speak, right? Maybe there might be some fears about shifting power to the community, and then, well, like, what is your relevance? What justifies your paycheck, so to speak? So I'm wondering if there are any of those two dilemmas that really do exist or not, and how you deal with those.
So the question is specifically an affective one on the part of people working for government and their comfort level in ceding power. Is that or just sort of maybe an anxiety about losing relevance? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So anxiety about losing relevance from the government official side.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because my sense is that the anxiety about losing relevance is there now, and the way that the standard response to that is command and control, and And so it's sort of a hardening of positions to maintain one's status. And I think the reality of the situation, however, is that relevance is based on these sorts of changes that we're talking about. This sort of transformation in institutions is tantamount to the continued relevance of public institutions, right? We cannot live in our society is moving in a direction such that the faceless top-down institutions will not be trusted because people have access to other modes of communication and information independent of those institutions. So unless those institutions do a good job of articulating that relevance around care and relation, then those institutions will continue to be an afterthought. So I think to the question of I think what your question was, which the actual people within government, how do they deal with this? And I think that there is certainly in my experience of working alongside government for many years and understanding, some of the anxieties that exist, the sort of lack of trust that people have in communities. So the lack of trust goes both ways, right? Communities distrust government, but often government distrusts communities. And this is why even in kind of participation measurements, right? It's the, more participation is not necessarily a good thing because government practitioners don't necessarily trust what they're going to get. They don't trust that anything is going to emerge from that. So there is a relational dynamic that needs to be worked out. But I think that into this relevance question, I think that what I'm most interested in is communicating to government practitioners that relevance is actually connected to this care transformation.
Thank you.
I see Yves, your hand is up.
Hi, Eric. Thank you very much. It was really remarkable. Eric, I have questions on the careful governance. Do you think this kind of model could be applied also in a situation of crisis? I'm thinking about not just emergency, a situation of violence, for example, between community or between government. I was just reflecting about that. Is it something that you've thought also?
Well, I don't think it can be applied in the situation of crisis. I think it needs to be applied prior to the situation of crisis, right? This is the key to resilience, is to build the connectivity and the relational infrastructure so that at the moment of crisis, that relational infrastructure is in place to allow that organization, institution, and community to rebound, not just to where they were, but stronger, right? Like that's what we want from resilient structures. So I think, and I know, from your background in your background in kind of international aid work, I think that it's the challenge here is how can you invest? The Red Cross is not typically good at investing in crisis before crisis happens, right? So I think there's a paradigm shift that requires an investment in institutional cultures prior to the time of crisis, which would be a complete paradigm shift for aid organizations like the Red Cross. I can just call on people. I see Kristen, your hand up here in my corner.
Sorry, one moment. Sorry, we had multiple questioners now, so I was a little floored. Give me 1 second. Let me unmute Kristen, and I think after that we can do, it seems like Professor Hammond, but I'm gonna unmute Kristen. Okay, you should be. There you go, Kristen.
Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Professor Gordon and the department for bringing you today. Really awesome talk and really interesting for me. I'm a PhD student in the department and also am working on a project locally here in Northampton that is a collaborative governance project. So this is really interesting for me. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the processes that have played out in some of the projects that you've been involved with. I'm thinking specifically about sort of how a governance structure that is atypical or different from sort of what people might be used to around a democratic process or the usual sort of ways that people engage publicly. Have you been able to witness sort of alternative forms of governance structures popping up in these projects? And how are people kind of engaging with those, and what challenges arise? Just if you could talk a little bit about process.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. I'd love to hear about what you're doing as well at some later time. And I'm also, you know, I also want to be conscious of or be clear about the fact that the Boston Collaborative Governance Initiative is a new thing, and we're kind of creating it together here. So I'm almost like, I almost want to call on other people to answer that question about that particular project. So I'm going to speak about other projects and kind of what has motivated me to do this work now. So my background is, I've done a lot of work around in civic games and sort of playful design around participation. So I've done a lot of what I now kind of think of as this sort of front end work around like building mechanisms for interaction between often government organizations and communities. And what I realized in doing that work for many years is that the back end was broken. That you can build interesting, interactive, and playful mechanisms for people to participate, but if there's no one listening on the back end, and there's no sort of like trusted receptacle for that data to go to, then it's a huge waste of time. And this is, and so I sort of like, I had this realization at some point. It's like, the back end's broken. What am I doing? Focusing all this time on the front end. So I would have a lot of experiences to share with you where I've been disappointed in the outcomes, where I've focused so much on creating that kind of user experience that's meaningful, and then what happens to it later is frustrating. And part of why I'm so passionate about this work I'm doing now with the collaborative governance group is that there's a sort of collective effort of stakeholders from government and also from community and from academia who are sort of thinking through these issues about like, how do we as academics actually work with communities in a way that's not extractive? How do government practitioners work with communities in a way that's honest and acknowledging of their power within every situation? And then how do communities effectively, how can they be actors with the appropriate amount of agency in these situations? And then when we collectively gather data about a situation, are we able to share it? Do we have the processes in place where, and this is where the pandemic really brought all this to the surface, which is like all this data exists. The government didn't have the right data. The community had very, very particular data, wasn't able to get it out in most cases. Or even if they could, it didn't have the sort of trusted mechanisms to flow and be useful, right? So it's really those mechanisms that are so profoundly in need of design, right? And so that's where my head is at the moment. And I think to your point, I've also been doing some work in outside of the United States in Romania, in Cluj, Romania. And that's been really interesting in that there's a number of things going on in Cluj. And what I'm learning about in Cluj is the way that multiple sectors are building these various forums to interact with each other in a way that where information can pass, again, from one stakeholder to another in a non-traditional form. So in Cluj, different than the United States, the context of trust in government is very different. There's zero trust in government, and there's historical trauma associated with communism, and it's just a different context. And it's been incredible to learn about the mechanisms that might actually be applicable in the U.S. that are deeply tied to sort of trust building and relationship building in a city context. So I've learned a lot from these sort of outside of the U.S. Explorations. So I guess let me try one more time to provide a succinct answer to your question. I think things are different now than they were a year ago. I think that the pandemic and the resulting the racial reckoning and all that went with that has changed the discourse and willingness to think about governance in a new way. So even though the practices were emergent a year ago, now I think they're mainstreaming. And then we have to, like, while they're mainstreaming, we got to capture them, we got to figure them out. And we have to, make it so that they stick around. And it's not just an immediate response to the pandemic. So that was a rambling answer, but I hope it was somewhat satisfying.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Sophie said her question was answered. So maybe we'll go to Mark, and then we'll go to John, who also had a question. But first, Mark, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Sure. So thanks a lot. And Eric, that was really a fantastic talk. I think it just generated a lot of deep reflection on sort of how we think about governance and how we think about finding that balance between emergent social relationships and a need for some sort of institutionalization. Because if we're talking about a framework of care, we have to think about responsibility, accountability, durability, as well as, sort of establishing those caring relationships. So, how do we make those relationships last and ensure that they're in place long-term and that people can really rely on them? And so your discussion of trust, I think, is really important. So I had just asked a question in the chat about whether, and this is just a more general question about whether you have struggled with invoking a term that has a history of implications that are very different from the implications that you are attributing to it. We generally think of, caregiving and care receiving as a particular type of relationship that has an element of dependence to it and so on. And you're really talking about kind of mutual caregiving. And so I just wonder whether that's in any way a struggle for you theoretically or in the implementation of this idea of caring governance.
Well, I'll start with saying that it's funny that we're calling the work that we're doing in Boston Collaborative Governance Initiative. This for many of the people who are working with me on this initiative, this could be the first time that they've actually heard me talk about care. So it's not something that is necessarily a word that I'm using to sort of frame or brand the work that we're doing. Maybe, but at the moment, I think you're probably right that that word sort of communicated outside of context may not make sense, right? So we're at the moment, at least, we're calling this collaborative governance, even though I just gave a talk about why collaborative governance is insufficient. But yeah, that's what we're calling it, because I think it just resonates more. I think it just makes more sense off the bat, and then we can complicate it later. But yeah, and we've struggled with that, and I'm looking forward to talking to my colleagues here afterwards, is to see if they think that care is a worthwhile word to use in our work. But it hasn't been something that I've jumped towards because I think it does require some contextualization. And what's interesting is that there's so much work that's been done by feminist philosophers over the last couple decades in this space. And much of it has been applied to the institutional context, but I think that there's a lot more work to be done to make that explicit and mainstream that. And I'm excited about helping to do that kind of scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question from John, and I also noticed there's a question from Sophie. So I'll go with John first and then continue with Sophie. So you can unmute, John. John, are you not, do you want to skip the question?
I think he's trying to unmute and can't.
Oh, okay, hold on.
Is my sense, yeah. Read his sign language.
Bingo, there we go. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
there we
thank
go.
you.
Okay.
Well done, Eric. Sorry to go in front of you there, Sophie. The question is about how to get people to care about caring. And I'm not going to question the caring as a frame. This is more just kind of a big question about the disengaged or alienated public. So one of the critiques of engaged, participatory, deliberative interventions is that they can't reach people who are out of reach. And so you've done so many different things and I've studied so many different things. I would love to hear you talk about something that's relatively lightweight, that does more than just reporting like 311, but actually draws people in without kind of burdening them with too many meetings and so on. So where do you think there's real excitement about potential inclusion across demographic and ideological divides?
Well, thanks for the question, John. I mean, maybe I can, my first reaction is to say something like, maybe the framing of, maybe the approach is wrong. Maybe the approach has been wrong, which has been kind of institutions wanting people to care about them, right? You know, this is what government does. Government wants to be like, how do we engage people? How do we do it? And it's like, well, because like the way that you're approaching it is wrong, right? Like you're not engaging people like it's, you know, it's like a hook that you're trying to, you know, you're fishing or something. And so this is where I think care might have a more, if we adopt the framework of care and we adopt that kind of relational frame, then it's not about institutional engagement, but it's about relation. And I hear what you're saying about, well, I don't want to go to 12 meetings a week and relations take time and I don't want them. But I think there's and maybe that's the institutional frame that's the problem, right? So no one wants necessarily a relationship with their government. Maybe some people do, but that's not necessarily what's of value here. But if we sort of broaden it out to the context of governance, right? And we talk about like how public decisions get made, and it's not about me having a relationship with my government necessarily, but it's about me having a relationship with others where I'm able to act on, create, ideate, act on those things. So in that sense, it does become more interpersonal and less person to institution. And I think we have an opportunity there to, sort of steer away from that institutional paradigm of, we need to get people to care about us, as opposed to like, actually, we need to do a better job of distributing caring responsibilities. It's not about us. Like if we're good caregivers, then we're gonna step back and allow caring to take place without having to demand the attention of the kind of jumping in care that can be paternalistic.
Thank you. And we got Sophie. I'm gonna ask you to unmute. Hopefully this will work.
I was just wondering where we could find more of your research about Cluj, but I'm sure I could find it somewhere. I found a little...
No, you can't. It's not published yet. So yeah, so you can't find that yet. But probably in the next couple months, I'll have a public-facing report on that work before an academic publication. So if you reach out to me, I will certainly keep you in the loop. Are you from Cluj? You're muted. You can't speak. Okay.
Hold on. Let me unmute Sophie again. Yeah. Yep.
I'm not, but I've been there.
Okay.
For a little while. It was very cool.
Great.
And we had Anna Maria's comment. She's from Romania. I don't know if Anna Maria has a question or she just wanted to comment, but I'll just ask her to unmute if she wants to ask a question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up on that idea about Romanians learning about democracy 31 years ago. And that, yeah, it's been difficult. I've been working in Romania. Right now I'm an international student, recently moved to the US. And yes, sometimes the authorities, from my experience as an architect, believe that they're making decisions in the community's name because they feel that the communities lack expertise and they feel that they are saving themselves from poor decisions. So I just wanted to follow up on that idea. But we're learning. Cluj is definitely, yeah, one place to start. There's great community involvement there compared to the rest of Romania.
Yeah, just a quick comment about that. That what's interesting about, I talked about leadership in my talk and how that is important. And Cluj is an example of the importance of leadership. So in Cluj, there's a relatively new mayor. It's been around for about 10 years, or maybe 12, and completely changed things. And it was a rhetorical change at first, but he brought people. He brought people in a sort of different philosophy of governing. It was really important, right? So I mean, I hope that you don't come across or come away with this talk thinking that I don't think that what Cori Bush is doing is incredibly valuable. It is, and what the mayor of Cluj is doing is incredibly valuable. Leadership matters, but when leadership happens and there's no mechanism to support it, that's the problem, and that's actually kind of what we're seeing in Cluj. There's incredible leadership, and the sort of mechanisms around the leadership is not quite there, and they're struggling to kind of manifest these new modes of governance because of that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Carolina and then Mark. So Carolina, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Carolina Aragon, I'm a landscape architect and a public artist who's done a lot of underground type of community engaged work. And as we're having this conversation, something that comes to mind, this is not a very well-informed question, but just sort of thinking about campaigns of misinformation. And have you considered, in an era where we believe such different things, and the scale of the impact that the media has on people's opinions, how could that play? Have you given some thought as to how this could fit in this framework of care?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about it. It's a great question, and it's something that I think it's hard for me at the moment to disentangle the kind of national or international misinformation flows and what's happening on a local level, right? And so, so we know what happens on, like, COVID has introduced all sorts of challenges with information and misinformation on a local level. So we see that happening, and we see some of that's connected to kind of national and international information flows. But where it emerges and what the role of local institutions are in combating and or augmenting, information is, I think, is a challenge. I don't know if Ethan is still in the call, but his work on misinformation, I think, is I have yet to talk to Ethan about this, but specifically this sort of this relation between national and local. So it's an incredibly good question, and it's something that I will be spending some time on in the coming years, really trying to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. And we got a flood of questions from 3 different people. So, oh, and by the way, Ethan has left the meeting.
Okay.
So we got Mark, William, and then we got Nevin. So let me unmute Mark first.
So thanks. And this was just a quick follow-up question to your previous response around Cluj's. What do you think the prospects are for the sort of scalability of this governance model? Does it work best or exclusively at a very kind of hyper local level where people can have face-to-face interaction and know each other, or is there a conception of creating caring governance at a regional, state, national, international level, and what would be the challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I'll start with the Cluj example. One of the things that's interesting about Cluj, perhaps similar to Boston, but at a bigger scale, is that there's a foundation that's invested in Cluj to build some of these structures out. So there's money that's flowing in to the city that's actually enabling some of this collaboration to happen. So the first thing I'll say is that money matters right now, and so, like, that's interesting. I don't know to what extent it matters and how is it even possible without like a big flow of money? So it's an open question. So that's the Cluj thing. In terms of scale, yes, I do think that it extends beyond the local scale. And in fact, I think it extends beyond government. And we've been talking a lot about government because we've been talking about the sort of local city scale. My student Tomas is here, and he, I know he's interested in how how perhaps this paradigm might be important for say tech companies and how they're thinking about the way in which they move forward at this moment, and how they're sort of building out these kind of networks, sort of trust enabling networks essentially. So I think it's useful. And I'll say another piece of research that I'm doing right now is with news organizations. Journalism is in a similar crisis, right? Of a sort of trough of disillusionment with journalistic institutions. And so the way that journalism organizations are shifting to be more relational is something that's happening as well. And that's actually happening both in very small news outlets, but it's also happening in large news outlets like the LA Times has they just hired something like 12 engagement editors whose job it is to sort of form these relationships with communities. Now, I'm not saying that it's being done well, but it's being done. There is a sense that institutions need to open up in a way that's not happening. And so I think what's interesting, and cities around the world, or cities around the country, I'll say, are increasingly hiring engagement officers, right? Chief engagement officers sometimes in cities, and there's a lack of clarity as to what they do. And so a lot of it is just kind of marketing, and the kind of thing I was saying about kind of institutional engagement, like you engage with us, and then some of it's more relational. So I think there's this opportunity to really shift. So money is beginning to flow. Because this has become a priority, and now we need to understand it a little bit more so money can flow in the right way. And I suppose that's where we are, and that's like, so we begin with rhetoric, and now we have to sort of understand how to actually institutionalize some of this work. It's easier for me to conceive of this on a local level than it is on other scales, but I think that it's possible, and I don't have any good models or things to point to on a state or even national scale at this point, but I'd like to explore that further. So thank you.
Thank you. And we got William and then Nevin. So I'll ask William to unmute.
First of all, thanks for taking the time tonight. This has been a very interesting talk. So kind of going off of what Mark was saying about the scalability of this self-governance, and what you mentioned earlier about the hard to reach groups of people. The first thing I thought about when you mentioned that was like the most impoverished people of society. And in order to like create this caring community, do you think that it would be necessary for the ultra wealthy, the opposite of the more hard to reach groups? Would there need to be some sort of redistribution of wealth to give it more of a community feel if the scalability were to be increased?
I think there's a lot going on in that question. I think because part of what you're talking about is sort of a just society, right? It's like, yeah, redistribution of wealth is a requirement for a just society. That's a goal. I think that's a goal. But I don't know that it's exactly what I'm getting at, in that I'm trying to understand the sort of mechanisms that might enable a goal like that. But I don't know that, like, I'm not saying we need to start with the redistribution of wealth. Like that's a policy, that's something I'd love to see happen. But I don't know that it's a prerequisite for doing the kind of work that I'm describing. I think did I answer your question? No, you're stuck. You're
hold on.
silent.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, sorry. I think people just mute right away after they ask the question. Let me unmute William.
Okay.
Yeah, William, you can unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I guess, I mean, I agree. I just wasn't sure if you meant that was like a big part of the community aspect, but I understand what you're saying about how it's not necessarily the first thing that would happen, but it would be probably an effect of this.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that, power sharing takes a remarkable amount of trust. Those who have power, understanding how to share it, which is what's required, is incredibly difficult. And I think that to an earlier question about like the sort of anxieties around government practitioners, like I think that that's part of it. I think it also plays out along racial lines, right? Like, what does it mean for white people to acknowledge their power in situations, and what kind of, what does it mean practically? What kind of trust is necessary, and therefore, like, what kind of care is necessary? Like, I'm not gonna give up my power if I don't feel like I'm being cared for, right? Like, there's a sense of like mutuality that needs to be established in order for this to work, I think.
Thank you. Again, I think we're, it's probably a good time to wrap up, but I know there are a couple more questions, but maybe we can take one last question. Sorry about that, Eva, but Nevin had the first question. Let me unmute Nevin, and I think we might have to wrap up. So Nevin, you can unmute.
Hi, thank you, Eric. Really, yeah, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to like elaborate on John's question earlier about sort of reaching the unreachable, and a little bit what William was just talking about. I just was wondering if you could give an example of sort of like a careful governance approach to getting people, or getting, I know that you sort of just said that getting people to participate is sort of like might be like the opposite of the way that a careful governance would look at it. But if you could give like a more real world example, for me, it's a little bit easier to understand sometimes when I have an example, and sort of broadens my mind. So yeah, I was wondering if you had any examples of participation in careful governance.
Right. So, what's hard about this, I'm going to give you an example, but I just want to like put a bracket around it and say, like, one of the things that I was arguing is that we have to look beyond projects, right? And so I'm going to point to a project, and then I'm going to say, well, let's look beyond that project, and let's look at how that project is, how that project might have implications, in the kind of institutional framework that holds it. I think we can look at it's hard to pick just one. What's often an example that's often used in CoDesign, for example. So I'm going to talk about CoDesign, and in the design of cities, which I think is relevant to this group. And the idea of putting cutouts in sidewalks, right? Like that emerged from a direct response to people with disabilities, people who are in wheelchairs, who need access, right? So it was a direct response to a particularly marginalized population, and it was perhaps a sort of expression of caring for the needs of a typically unheard group of people. What's interesting about that, though, is that when those sidewalks got cut, it was designed from the margins, but then it became something with mainstream appeal. So now, people pushing a stroller can use the cutouts, or if you're on a skateboard or a bicycle, right? Like there's all sorts of, so you design for the people who need it most. And then from there, there's those people who don't necessarily need it most are not going to be harmed by it, but are potentially going to benefit from it. And so that's an example where I think like the shape of most cities, is emerged from a specific caring need and a specific response to that caring need that I think we all can say has benefited the collective.
Thank you.
So
thank you, Eric, for indulging us in all of those wonderful questions. And I think that's it. We're out of time, but I want to thank all of you for coming today. I really enjoyed the talk, Eric, and I really enjoyed the conversation afterwards. And my only disappointment is that we can't all go out to dinner now to talk some more.
Next time.
Yes, next time.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And Frank, I don't know if you want the last word, but it's yours if you would like it.
No. Thank you, Camille. You invited Eric. I'm thankful you can come, and I'm just here to kind of present the organization. And yeah, I mean, I'm very happy we had so many good questions here. And,
yeah, it's great.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Eric.
you.
Thank you, Camille.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.